This, whoops, do this first. Be all over here. All right. Evening, everybody. As promised, we're going to we're going to go backwards a little bit in time. We've spent the last few months dealing with personalities that were of the Hasidic world, the non-Hasidic world. We brought us into the 19th century, last class with Rav Hirsch, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And we're going to go back to the earlier part of the 18th century and go into the early part of the 19th century. Not all tonight, but basically what we're going to do is to go through a time period, beginning with a man named Moses Mendelssohn, for us to be able to understand the earthquake that he caused, about him, the causes, the work against it, what was going on in the Jewish world, eventually the French Revolution, which we talked about months ago, and Napoleon and the Jews. That's the next 2 or 3 classes, Bezrat Hashem. So I call this Faith, Reason, and Revolution, Jewish history from Mendelssohn to Napoleon. That's kind of a broad topic, but also, just so you see, we're going to be speaking about this man tonight. Again, in order to understand this time period that we're going back to and the trajectory and everything else, we're going to be talking about Moses Mendelssohn, and not this week, but Mr. Napoleon Bonaparte. I guess he wasn't Mr. In any case, this is the time period we're going to deal with. We're going to come back to slides in a little while. There'll be something worth that I'll need to put up on the screen. The point I wanted to make over the last few months was that in order to understand what was going on in the Jewish world, we first had to understand the people. And that's why we did spend quite a bit of time going through all the Hasidic masters, not all, many of the Hasidic masters, much of the Naged world, those who opposed the Hasidic world, talked about them. And now we're going to, like I said, go back. We're going back to the time right around, matter of fact, this man, Moses Mendelssohn, who we're going to talk about in a moment, is born when the Baal Shem Tov is 30. Remember, he was the founder of the Hasidic movement. And the Vilna Gaon was a little boy. He was 9 years old. But I guarantee you, at 9 years old, he knew more than I'll know the rest of my life. In any case, we need to understand first a little bit about who Moses Mendelssohn was. He's born in 1729. Again, like I said, this is already, the Baal Shem Tov is around. The Vilna Gaon as a kid is around. He's born in Dessau in Germany. And unlike many of the people we've spoken about who grew up in these aristocratic families and rabbinic families and were seen as geniuses, the poor little guy was a sickly, weak child born into poverty. He would go from that to being called eventually the German Socrates, who became one of the foremost philosophers of his time. And a man who opened the gates for German Jews into German society. Now, he was one big paradox, as we will see when we talk about him, that his life took one path, veers, and splits into a lot of other ways. To some people, he would be considered a hero. He was a hero because he showed the Jews, Torah Jews, because he was at this point religious, could stand as equals and intellectuals along their non-Jewish fellow, citizens of the country in the salons of Europe, and they could be able to carry on conversations. But to others, he becomes the father of what will be called in Hebrew hitbolelut, or assimilation. At the end of the day, his own children eventually all convert to Christianity, one of whom becomes a Lutheran minister. And after he already passes away, I'm kind of giving you like the Brashe Procuma, like the footnote, the bullet points here. Eventually, what he does is gives birth to what becomes known as the Reform movement of Judaism. Now, the question you might ask yourselves, even before we start, is like, why do I care about Reform Judaism? Well, if we're learning Jewish history, not learning halakha, Reform Judaism is a very important part of that, and this is where the journey begins. The amount of people in the world who identify between Orthodox, conservative, reform conservative movement is shrinking drastically. Either they're becoming more religious or leaving completely, becoming more like a Reform Jew. Reform Jew is the most of those three divisions, the most liberal and has many beliefs that are absolutely antithetical to Torah, as we will see. But where did that come from? Like, you can look around with the United States or in other countries, and you see there's a lot of Reform Jews. Like, how did it just happen? So we have to understand first who Moses Mendelssohn was and what did he stand for. Like I say, he's born as a child. He's a sick child. He had curvature of the spine, but he did actually have a pretty brilliant mind. He was already known not as necessarily a genius, but a thinker at a young age. Now you could think to yourself like, okay, he wasn't a Torah genius like we've seen others. What do you mean he was a thinker? So I can tell you anecdotally that over the last 16 years, even more, but especially in the last 16 years here, that I've taught many, Baruch Hashem, many kids in this neighborhood, I have been astounded by a handful of them who at an early age, I'm talking 10, 11, are asking questions that I didn't think of until I was an adult. So you do have, and it wasn't just like, who made God? I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm talking much deeper than that. And what's great is it challenges me as a teacher, but it also it enables me to hopefully nurture and bring out this thought process. The worst thing a teacher can do is to stymie someone who wants to learn. So he did have this brilliant mind as a child. Already at age 14, he goes to the city of Berlin. There's a Rabbi David Frankel, who was his Rav, his rabbi, and he wanted to go there to Berlin, but it was a city pretty much that was closed to Jews. I know it's hard to believe in such a modern time that we live in that Jews could have trouble in any city, but there was a time, yes, that's called sarcasm, that there was a time when Jews were prohibited from living in certain areas. It was dangerous to live in certain areas. They had no rights as citizens. We know that already. We'll talk about that, of course, during the time period pre-Holocaust. But Mendelssohn is able to enter Berlin under what's called special protection due to his rabbi. Somehow he's able to finagle something, which we will see in a little bit. He supports himself by tutoring children and working as a bookkeeper. Remember, he's a teenager, but somehow he starts to put together enough knowledge base to be able to support himself. And in the evenings, he would study Gemara, Latin, Greek, German, and philosophy. So you already start to see this foundation being laid down for his growth in many areas. Now let's put a little parentheses here. And if you remember what we talked about last week with Rav Hirsch, that we know that Rav Hirsch was very much, his hallmark was Torah in Derech Eretz, which eventually becomes Torah Mada, the idea of, yes, you have to have a Torah life, but you also have to be well-rounded. You have to have a university education. So what I'm about to talk about sounds very similar. So what's the problem? So let's make sure it's very clear up front. The massive difference between Rav Hirsch and someone like Mendelssohn was by Rav Hirsch, it was critical that everything non-directly related to Torah was secondary and needed to be integrated into a Torah world. You didn't learn philosophy just to learn philosophy. You learned it to understand better in maybe the Rambam. You didn't learn astronomy to learn astronomy. You did it in order to understand certain parts of the Gemara and so on, and math and certain other things. This is not what Mendelssohn was really pushing for, which we will see. He early on is also involved in some important literary undertakings. He writes certain things. I'm not going to get into dates and years. It's immaterial. But he did go do something kind of dangerous as a Jew and as a sort of citizen of Prussia. He criticized the poems of Frederick II, who was the king of Prussia at the time. And because of his good nature, the king had good nature, and he wasn't one of these Middle Ages kind of crazy leaders. He didn't get it, it didn't get him, meaning Mendelssohn didn't get him into trouble. He marries a woman whose last name you will know. He marries a woman in 1762. Now, keep in mind, this is just shortly before the American Revolution and about 30 years before the French Revolution. It's also part, you got to keep these things in mind. When we talked about the revolutions, these revolutions, and the Jewish revolution of Hasidut over the last many months ago, we talked about this idea, and we've seen it, whether it was the fall of communism, the Arab Spring, how an idea starts to float around the world and kind of is in a domino effect. And that's what's happening at this point in history as well. So whereas we saw the revolution of Hasidut, the revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, this is going to be another kind of revolution within Judaism, not a good one, but this is the beginning of it. He marries a woman named Frumit Guggenheim. She was a distant relative of Solomon Guggenheim, the founder of the Guggenheim Museum, yet another place I've never been. And after he dies, actually, she lives 26 years longer than him, which has nothing to do with the story, but just is a little fact. The year after he got married, Mendelssohn wins a prize. The prize is offered by the Berlin Academy for an essay he wrote having to do with mathematical proofs in physics. And don't ask me what. I can tell you the title is Evidence of the Medical Physical Sciences. That's all I can tell you what it was. But the reason it's important to know that is to understand who he was rubbing shoulders with. His two competitors, the top two competitors, were Thomas Abt, and maybe a name you may not know, but the other one you will, is Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant, they came in second right behind Mendelssohn. We're not going to talk about Kant. If you don't know about him, do your own research, but he was another brilliant mind of the time. And in 1763, the year after he wins this award, evidently it was very prestigious, and from the Berlin University, which was a very prestigious place at the time, the king of the country grants him, interestingly enough, not his wife nor his children, privilege, what's called a protected Jew, a Schutzjude. Now, down the road, you're going to learn about, my mind just went blank. He makes something called the Schutzpass. It'll come to me. It's a word that we're going to use now. We're going to use a similar word later. But in any case, right now, he has a protected status. He's not necessarily a full-fledged citizen, but he was given, it allows him to have rights to walk around Berlin undisturbed. He's allowed to have a residence in Berlin. It's an upgrade even more than he was given when he first came there as a 14-year-old. Mendelssohn's philosophical works had some of the background and feel of Greek philosophy. It impressed the German world so strongly with the beauty of the words, the clearness of what he was writing. And some of his writings were immediately accepted, were a tremendous success. Again, only forget the Judaism. He hasn't written about Judaism at all yet. It's just building up his bona fides about who he was as a philosopher, as an author. And he writes a book called Phaedo, P-H-A-E-D-O, which becomes a big-time bestseller and is translated into many languages, including English, a work of philosophy. And it is after he writes that book, again, you want to know about more, just Google it. I'm not going to take the time on it. But after that, he becomes known as the German Plato or the German Socrates. Now, if you even know a modicum, a drop of anything about philosophy, those two names, Plato and Socrates, will mean something to you. We have the idea of what's called the Socratic method, learning through questions and answers from Socrates, or as someone would say in one of the movies I've seen, Socrates. And he rises, in a sense, to a royal stature, an aristocratic level among his peers and among the German citizenship. It was said that, I'm going to read you a quote that I have here. No stranger who came to Berlin failed to pay his personal respects to the German Socrates. He became a very well-known person. Now let's compare here. When people like Reb Chaim Reb Chaim Volozhin and Reb Yaakov Emden and Reb Yonason Eibschutz and all these names that we've talked about the last few months, when they were little, they become very well known for their Torah, for their magnificence, their knowledge of Shas, of Gemara, all by heart and all. He, at this point in his life, a young man, is known for his philosophical work. And he devotes his talents to philosophy and to criticism in the critical writing. But there was an incident that happened that caused him to not only focus on general philosophy of life, but to move it towards the direction of a cause having to do with Judaism as well. 1763, a man named Johann Caspar Lavater, he was a young theology student from Zurich, Switzerland, who came on a trip to Berlin. And he visited Mendelssohn, who's already become, like I say, this very famous Jewish philosopher. He's not famous at all about being a Jew. He's famous for being a philosopher. And they insisted, he and others who came to him, insisted, especially this Lavater, insisted on Mendelssohn telling them his views on Jesus. Mendelssohn basically wrote, now he had to remember, he's still considered at that point an Orthodox Jew, especially for that time period what it meant. We will get to the topic of how Judaism, and not because of reform, how Orthodox Judaism morphs a little bit, and the infighting about certain aspects, specifically in Germany, about Jews will be called the status quo Judaism and all kinds of interesting things. But right now, in general terms, he is a religious Jew. And he said, quote, he respected the morality of the character of Jesus. A few years later, Lavater sends Mendelssohn a German translation of the Charles Bonnet essay on Christian, it's called Christian Evidences. And he challenges Mendelssohn to refute Bonnet. And if he couldn't, he would say that the implication would be that something's wrong with his philosophical approach, because obviously Jesus was smart and Christianity is right. It was a very in-your-face attack on Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn answers Lavater in a letter he publishes in 1769. I'm going to read you one sentence. And he says very interestingly, now also Lavater says, look, if you can't answer this, then you really should convert to Christianity, because obviously they're right, you're wrong. He, meaning Mendelssohn, is not one of these out there religious Jews. He's Jewish, he's religious, but he's not out there. That's not what he's about. And he's being told if he can't refute on the level of philosophy and who is as known as that he couldn't refute the philosophy of Jesus, then he should really convert to Jesus. So what is it? So Mendelssohn responds by writing, I'll read you the sentence. Suppose there were living, obviously he wrote it in German, not in English. Suppose there were living among my contemporaries a man like Confucius or Solon. I could, according to the principles of my faith, love and admire the great man without falling into the ridiculous idea that I must convert to be someone who follows Confucius. What was he saying? I can respect the philosophy, I can respect the beliefs, I can respect the statements, the words, the teachings of somebody, but doesn't mean that I have to then follow that person. I don't have to become a Christian. I can say that some of the things he said were good, they were sensible. Remember, we talked about Jesus. He grew up a religious Jew. He learned in Yeshiva in Prachya. It's a name you'll know if you remember Pirkei Avot. This public controversy, because this was not private, this was public controversy, cost Mendelssohn a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of strength. Later on, Lavater describes Mendelssohn in a book that I'm going to read you the quote. He describes him as a companionable, brilliant soul with piercing eyes, the body of an Aesop, who was traditionally considered ugly, a man of keen insight, exquisite taste, and wide erudition, frank and open-hearted, ending his public praise with the wish of Mendelssohn recognizing, together with Plato and Moses, the crucified glory of Yashki. Lavater respected him, but he also was giving him some digs. And at the same time, now what Mendelssohn is facing is this life that he's built until now has been based on philosophy, and now it's been thrown in his face, his religion as well. Like, dude, stand up for your religion in a sense. So in 1775, the Swiss German Jews faced what Jews had faced in England in the 1200s and the 1400s in Spain, and for over the centuries in other places, faced the threat of being expelled from the country. And Mendelssohn, being a well-known public figure, was asked to go to his, quote, friend Lavater and to intervene on behalf of the Jews. And eventually it worked. He's able to secure the Jews, protect them from the government's throwing them out of the country. Okay, that was very nice. So now he's not only been faced with this crisis in public of the difference of Judaism, Christianity, you should be converting, and now your Judaism has to come up. But now, in addition to that, he's very much out there protecting his fellow Jews. All this is growing in his mind, in his soul. His goal eventually becomes to show that Judaism and reason, or philosophy, regular quote unquote day-to-day life, were completely compatible. In 1783, he writes a book called Jerusalem. And in it, he argues that Judaism is not a religion of dogma, but a religion of practice. This is going to plant the early seeds of what will become Reform Judaism, which won't take hold until after he dies. We'll see in a few minutes. He said that Christianity imposes creeds. Judaism imposes commandments. Revelation, in the view of Mendelssohn, doesn't give new truths, but what it does is gives eternal laws for living. The truths about God, morality, and the soul can be reached by reason alone. It's a really important sentence. We have to keep this in mind. We have to keep in mind another thing. At the same time in Europe is this whole topic of the Enlightenment, which we dealt with months ago. The idea of opening your mind and broadening your horizons in art, in history, in science, in medicine, in every way, disconnecting from the rule of the church. And that reason is called the age of reason, for a reason. He says that we could come to the idea of the truth about God. We could come to the idea of what it means to be a moral person and what the soul is all about, strictly by using logic and reason. He said that Judaism did not contradict the Enlightenment or Enlightenment philosophy, but it actually was the embodiment of Enlightenment philosophy, which it wasn't. Obviously, it was not. So again, you might be saying to yourself, how is he different than Rav Hirsch? Because again, Rav Hirsch is saying we need to keep our religion. We need to be religion fealty to Torah. At the same time, we also have to have our minds open. We have to think about arts and science and math and da, 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 da. Again, I remind you, because he wanted to intertwine the two. Never would he say you can come to an understanding of God through philosophy, just reason. Never would he have said you can come to the idea of what mitzvot should be just through reason. Because 100%, it would be impossible to say, you know what, I'm going to give you a job. I'm not going to tell you any of what the mitzvot are, but you're going to come up based on just logic and reason and Jewish philosophy, what the 613 mitzvot should be. Impossible. Because you're not going to come up with the idea of shooing away a mother bird from this week's parasha. This week's parasha, Ki Tetzei, has, and it's easy to remember, has the most mitzvot of any parasha. The Torah has 74 mitzvot. The gematria of Ayin Dalet are 74. Aid, witness, that you wouldn't come up with more than 2 or 3 of them, because many of them have nothing to do with logic or reason. It has to do with mitzvot Hashem gave us. And yet, from the perspective of Mendelssohn, as he's starting to promulgate this idea, we should be able to have intuited some of this by our own reason. I'll read you one sentence from his book, Jerusalem. It says, the truths of reason are available to all. Revelation confirms them for the Jewish people through the Torah, meaning that you could come to some of these ideas yourself, but you also have the Torah, which kind of backs it up and says, yeah, see, they were right. What did it do? It helped make the Jews respectable in the eyes of Christian enlightenment. But at the same time, it began to shift Judaism in a different direction, not as a nation, but as a faith community. He felt that he had written so much and given so much in philosophy, the time was ripe for it to write about Judaism. And if you're going to write about Judaism, the best place to start with is the Torah. Now, we talked about last week that Rav Hirsch also wrote a commentary on the Torah, which will be after this. But Mendelssohn writes a commentary on Torah. It's called the Bi'ur. Bi'ur means the explanation. Leva'er means to explain. This translation was a giant project. It was the translation of the Chumash into German. And he wrote a commentary in Hebrew called the Bi'ur. He wanted Jews in Germany to learn German and to integrate in society. That's part of it, is the language, while also remaining rooted in Torah. So I want to make sure that something's really clear. Many of the Jews spoke Yiddish. Many of the Jews may have spoken some level of Hebrew as well, but not a lot of Yiddish. But German wasn't not necessarily within the confines. I use the word ghetto loosely at the moment. Was not the main language that they were speaking. And he wanted to force the issue that if we're going to integrate, it doesn't say assimilate, if we're going to integrate into German society, we have to be able to speak the language. And by the way, he was right. When a person comes to Israel, they make Aliyah, for many people, one of the barriers in integration is language, and will remain in a very small area or bubble of English speakers, or will be able to branch out or to completely integrate. It all depends on the person. Some people have, just can't pick up the language, and some people pick it up the day they land, not to such an extent. But I'm saying is that the concept of integration from that perspective is completely right. So therefore, he takes the fundamental text of Judaism, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, translates it into German. He writes his commentary on it in Hebrew, so he has both. His intention was pretty good. I mean, he wanted to uplift Jewish education. He wanted to give Jews access to European culture and to improve their standing in society. Why would you want to improve your standing in society? Well, he was also a student of history. He understood what was happening for the last few hundred years. Let's not forget the expulsion of the Jews, the Chmielnicki massacres in the 1600s, the Gzerot Tachvatat, all these things, he knew about all those. And in all those cases, the Jews were always they were always the different ones. They were always a different community. We will learn that the word ghetto is actually from Italian, its own segregated neighborhood, whether it was in the model of what will become in World War II, pre-World War II, not necessarily, but they were always the other. And what always separated them was language. That was a big one. But the Bi'ur, this commentary on the Torah, became very controversial. The rabbinic community, the Orthodox rabbinic community, started to feel that the problem could be that the fact that they could start learning more German and the pushing of this very well-known popular man would push the Jews into German culture, and that Mendelssohn was opening the door to assimilation. By the way, spoiler alert, they were completely right, because it does. The time period we're talking about is called in Hebrew the Haskala, He Sin Kaf Lamed He, from the word Seichel, or intellect. And the people who were the practitioners who followed the philosophy of Mendelssohn of integration and what we now would call assimilation, were called maskilim. Later, maskilim would use this bi'ur, the commentary that Mendelssohn wrote, as a doorway out of traditional Judaism. They would teach Torah as literature rather than divine law. So if you know anything about Reform Judaism, that little red light should have just gone on. Because one of the hallmarks in Reform Judaism, many of them are not Jewish, I don't know what percentage are, but in Reform, is that Torah is not mina shamayim. Torah is written by man, different authors at different time periods of history, and it's divinely inspired, but definitely not given to us by God. That's one of the hallmarks of this. And this is finding its root in what the rabbis were concerned with in the late 1700s of what Mendelssohn was doing. Mendelssohn becomes friends with some pretty powerful people, leading German philosophers, including a man named Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who then immortalizes Moses Mendelssohn as a model preaching religious tolerance. Religious tolerance is a topic you hear about here in Israel. Religious tolerance, there's a difference. When we get to modern day Israel, we will learn different terms, such as that you know already, but we'll get more into depth. The difference between being sovlanim and savlanim, and all kinds of terms where the person's, whether it's a pluralistic society or you are, let's not, I don't want to digress right now. So I'm going to stop myself from getting into it. But he was admired for Mendelssohn for his humility and piety. Evidently, he was known, in spite of the fact that he was such a well-known public figure, he evidently was known for his humility. People described him as a person who faithfully went to shul. He observed mitzvot. He maintained his Jewish outward appearance, even though he conversed with princes and intellectuals. Mendelssohn was an absolute paradox, both fully Jewish and fully European. So just like when we learned about the Baal Shem Tov and his new approach to Judaism of love and of communication with Hashem and all these different ideas and joy and rapture and all that. I don't use rapture, it's Christian, but the joy, all those things were seen by the rabbinic community, remember, like the Vilna Gaon and others, like this is bad news. The same thing's going to happen here, whereas over there, it was tainted by the last 100 years before of the false messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, Yaakov Frank, and others. Here, it's now being seen as almost an attack on normative Judaism. And now, remember, we talked about a couple of people. One was named Rav Yaakov Emden. We'll mention him now again. He accused Mendelssohn of endangering Jewish souls by teaching secular philosophy. It wasn't Jewish philosophy he was teaching, it was secular philosophy. The Vilna Gaon never wrote directly about Mendelssohn, but he opposed the early Haskala movement that Mendelssohn inspired. Rav Hirsch also wrote later on. I'm going to read you a quote from one of his writings in English. Mendelssohn's own life was faithful to mitzvot, but his influence was disastrous. The generation that followed him tore itself away from Torah under the banner of enlightenment. I am sure every one of you at some point or another has had discussions with people, whether it's in your own family, your neighborhood, people in general. Just be a good person. That's all you need to do. You don't need to be keeping Torah, mitzvot. And by the way, we're part of the real world. We shouldn't be sitting in the Beit Midrash all day. We need to be out there. We need to understand arts and philosophy and medicine and math and psychology and psychiatry, everything we need to know about. And the Torah takes the back seat. All that is taking root already at this point in the mid to late 1700s. It's nothing new what we're going through today. Mendelssohn died in 1786. So that means he died 10 years after the American Revolution and just prior to the French Revolution. And when he died, he was respected both by Jews and by Christians. But within, like I say, within one generation, his own children all convert to Christianity. His son was now Felix Mendelssohn, who was a known composer. Not only was he Christian, he becomes a Lutheran. He's baptized as a Lutheran. For most Orthodox Jews, Mendelssohn is a symbol of failure because he tried to reconcile Torah with reason, and he ends up abandoning Torah, or causes the abandonment of Torah. But he is a turning point of Jewish history for much of what happens from this point on. I want to share with you A couple of things that were written. It's from the Enlightenment to Haskala. Enlightenment, remember, was the movement throughout Europe, breaking away from the church, and also the whole growth of Voltaire and all the people we spoke about months ago to what becomes known as the Haskala, which is the quote Jewish Enlightenment. And there was a series of letters. There were also responsa written in books. But right now, I'm going to read you, if I came across in English, a couple of letters between Mendelssohn and Yaakov Emden, Rav Yaakov Emden, who we talked about a couple of weeks back. And this is what Mendelssohn wrote in 1773 to Rav Yaakov Emden. This is the one real point of direct textual contact between a central maskil. Oh, sorry, this is the introduction I found. And Emden. Mendelssohn writes, German original here in translation. I don't remember where I picked this up. I am greatly surprised that the very learned and pious Rabbi Yaakov Emden is so gracious as to count me among those who love truth. For I have learned from youth onward that the study of our holy Torah is the most noble of occupations, and without it, man is like a beast. And then it gives the citation. Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote, on the right-hand side, one who speaks thus to deify Shabtai Tzvi. So evidently Mendelssohn took Shabtai Tzvi, remember the false messiah we learned about from the 1600s, and deified him. So like there was something there, is guilty of idolatry. And the Torah commands us to uproot such evil from Israel, even if it be as precious to us as the pupil of our eye. Relative to a couple things we're going to see, that's fairly parv. It's not really, he's saying this man Mendelssohn is guilty of idolatry, but it's still not as bad as some of the other stuff. The Noda B'Yehuda of Landau, who we didn't talk about in depth at all, is another person that we should learn more about, wrote the following: Kol ma shemechadshim b'dor hazeh. Now he's writing directly against the Maskilim and people like Mendelssohn. Kol ma shemechadshim b'dor hazeh. Every new thing, every innovation of this generation, meaning the changes that were wanted to be made to Judaism. Now, we haven't really talked about what those are yet. We will. Some minor changes and some very big changes. Uneged ritzon Hashem yitbarach, goes against Hashem. V'chol hamal'ig al divrei chachamim, whoever mocks the words of the chachamim, af im kavanato l'shem shamayim, even if his intention is in the right place. L'shem shamayim, that's based on pasuk. It basically means, he translates here as such a person breaches the fence and a serpent shall bite him. It's based on a pasuk. And that's the Noda B'Yehuda. And I'm not going to get into this slide right now. Okay, we'll come back to that at a different time. Okay. So we're talking about this individual who, Mendelssohn, who plants more than a seed. He plants an orchard that will eventually grow way beyond who he was after his death, which leads to the Haskala movement, like I say, the Jewish Enlightenment, which begins in Berlin, of course, makes sense because that's where he was, and spreads to Central Europe, to Eastern Europe, and becomes a very powerful movement that reshapes a section of the Jewish people and the Jewish identity. So I'm going to leave us with a couple of questions because I don't want to get to the next section. What exactly did Haskala stand for? I've mentioned it makes changes and grows, but what did it stand for? What were their principles? What do they want to change? Why did it attract so many people? And why did the rabbinic, the last one's fairly obvious, I'm not going to deal with it tonight, but is why did the rabbinic leaders see it as such a threat? That one, I think we've kind of touched on it already. Keep in mind, I'll just leave with one line, that is that the Maskilim, those who were in favor of this Haskala, the Jewish Enlightenment, their ultimate goal was to, quote, improve Judaism and improve Jews in multiple ways. We will see what those were. That's what we'll start with this Hashem next week. What were those ways? In other words, their heart, they were mistaken, they were misguided, they were wrong, but their heart was in the right place to a degree because they thought what they were doing was very similar to what European non-Jews were going through for the last couple of centuries, last 100 years. even a little bit less, depending when you date the beginning of the light, because there's all different opinions. That the people who are under the thumb of the church, this is why, by the way, it was so important to understand what the Enlightenment was and the relationship between the European society and the world and the church. Just like the church is now detached from European society and they're making their own decisions, it's not run by the church, and the whole long list of things we learned about the Enlightenment. So too, the people following Mendelssohn and the movement, the Haskala, known again as the Maskilim, felt they were doing the same thing, that they were going to enable their lives to become better, just like the other Europeans, their lives were becoming better as they divested themselves from the church. They did want them to still be Jews. They did want certain practices, but not some of the old-fashioned stuff. And what does that mean? We'll have to wait to see Bezrat Hashem next week. Meantime, have a wonderful evening, and B'sorot Tov for everybody. And we shall hopefully have some good news soon. We need it very much so. Have a good night, everybody.
Rabbi, next week, could you give an example of when you say Jewish philosophy versus non-Jewish philosophy? Because I've read Bloomberg and Rosenzweig in college. Unless you say every other word is Jew or Torah, I'm not sure what the difference is.
Right. Yes, I will. If you do me a favor when we're done, send me a message to remind me. I will put down. We'll talk. I'll give you a couple of ideas between the Yud Gimel Karim of Albo and the Saadia Gaon and the Rambam. It was not just a world outlook and stuff. It was more about how do the Jewish beliefs, not just doing something, but what's the grander philosophy of it relative to God. So, but yeah, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening and good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
All right. Bye-bye.